So Theros Beyond Death has been a fantastic set for Commander, with the new gods, the new titans, and all sorts of other exciting legends. There's a ton of awesome new build-arounds in this set, but I think some cards are slipping under the radar. And specifically, I want to talk about 5 cards that I think have a ton of potential in the Commander format, but not a lot of people are playing. So if you're looking for some obscure or spicy cards to surprise your opponents with, or if you're just looking for some great budget options, this is a great place to start. So hey there, I'm 2D, and this is my top 5 Commander sleepers from Theros Beyond Death. So let's hop right in. Number 5 is Whirlwind Denial. Whirlwind Denial is an instant that costs 2 and a blue. It reads, for each spell and ability your opponents control, counter it unless your opponent pays 4. Counter spells are a bit weaker in Commander than they are in other formats, because you really don't want to spend one of your cards to deal with one card from another opponent when you have 3 opponents. You're just not going to be able to keep up that way. But counters are useful in Commander as basically ways to save your skin. When your opponent plays something that just has to be stopped, that's when a counter spell feels amazing in Commander. And Whirlwind Denial is great because it has the flexibility to not only counter spells, but also abilities. Say your opponent plays a Nissa Vital Force. You let it resolve because you think, hey, I can attack it down, I don't have to worry about that thing ultimating. But then somehow they put a loyalty counter on it, maybe they proliferate it up, and all of a sudden your opponent is about to ultimate a Nissa and run away with the game. Where a normal counter spell would now be dead because you already let it resolve, Whirlwind Denial can actually counter her ultimate ability. So your opponent -6 Nissa, expecting to be able to draw extra cards for the rest of the game, you play Whirlwind Denial, and that ultimate just fizzles. Because in Commander, counters tend to serve as like a safety valve, sort of save your skin option, having this flexibility to counter spells or abilities makes Whirlwind Denial really great. And there's sometimes where you'll counter both. Say your opponent has an Argothian Enchantress on the battlefield. Argothian Enchantress reads, whenever you cast an enchantment spell, draw a card. So your opponent has an Argothian Enchantress and they cast an enchantment spell. The enchantment spell is on the stack, and also the trigger to draw a card off of Argothian Enchantress goes on the stack. If you decide you have to stop that enchantment from resolving and you cast Whirlwind Denial, not only do you counter that enchantment, you counter your opponent's card draw triggered ability as well. Whirlwind Denial is also a clean answer to one of the most powerful threats in the format, the Eldrazi. So the Eldrazi Titans all have win cast abilities. Take Ulamog for example. When you cast Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, exile 2 target permanents. If you were just to counter Ulamog, that cast ability still resolves as a separate event on the stack. But with Whirlwind Denial, when your opponent taps out to play Ulamog, you can cast Whirlwind Denial, counter the Ulamog, and also counter his cast ability, cleanly answering an Ulamog for only 3 mana. Another strategy that Whirlwind Denial is really good against is Storm. Storm is an ability that reads, when you cast this spell, copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. So if your opponent is on Storm and they're going off and they cast 10 spells and then cast a Mind's Desire, if you just counter the Mind's Desire, those other 10 copies are still going to resolve. But Whirlwind Denial would counter Mind's Desire and all of its 10 copies unless your opponent pays 4 for each. So Whirlwind Denial's flexibility in being able to counter both spells and abilities, and also being able to cleanly answer some really problematic threats like the Eldrazi Titan and Storm, make it a great inclusion in any Commander deck looking for a little protection. So moving on to number 4, we've got Allure of the Unknown. Allure of the Unknown is a sorcery that costs 3, a black, and a red. It reads, reveal the top 6 cards of your library. An opponent exiles a non-land card from among them, and you put the rest into your hand. That opponent may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. So basically, your opponent takes a look at the top 6 cards of your deck and picks whichever one they want, and then you get to draw the other 5. In most other formats where you only have one opponent, letting your opponent choose one of the cards to cast for free is just too significant of a downside to be able to play this card. But in Commander you've got 3 opponents, and the unique political aspect of Commander makes this card uniquely playable in the format. Say opponent 1 is really going off. They have a ton of creatures on board and they're going to kill the whole board unless somebody can find an answer to it. Well, you can look to opponent 2 and say, hey, we need a Damnation. I've got one in my deck. I'm going to cast Allure of the Unknown, and if Damnation is in my top 6, cast it and we can save the board. This effectively lets you dig 6 cards deep into your library to find an answer, while also drawing 5 cards. Another way to negate the downside of Allure of the Unknown is if you're playing a highly synergistic deck, something like a tribal deck. If you're playing Vampire Tribal, or Minotaur Tribal, or Zombie Tribal, or whatever, a deck where all your power comes from synergies between your different cards, then your opponent taking a random Minotaur off the top of your deck doesn't hurt you that much. The cards aren't really individually powerful, they're powerful because you have a deck built with synergy around it. This doesn't necessarily have to be tribal decks, just any deck with a high amount of synergy where the individual cards themselves don't have much power. And finally, there are a few ways where you can just prevent your opponent from actually casting the card they pick. Teferi, Mage of Zhalfir, for example, says each opponent can only cast spells anytime he or she could cast a sorcery. So when your opponent picks the card they want to cast, they can't, because it's not a time they could cast a sorcery. Your Allure of the Unknown is still resolving. This essentially just turns Allure of the Unknown into a 5-mana draw 5. So if you love politicking, if you love highly synergistic tribal decks, or if you just want to annoy somebody with a Teferi, Allure of the Unknown is a really cool new addition to the Commander format. So moving on to number 3, we have Escape Velocity. Escape Velocity is an aura that costs 1 red mana. It says Enchant Creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+0 and has haste. And it has Escape for 1 in a red and exiling 2 cards from your graveyard. By paying the escape cost, you can cast Escape Velocity from your graveyard. So when given a choice, most people will run equipment in their commander deck rather than auras. Why is that? It's because when your creature dies, you lose an aura, but not so for an equipment. You can just re-equip it to something else. I would argue that Escape Velocity has that same upside, but even more so. If an opponent casts Vandal Blast and blows up all the artifacts, poof, there go your equipment. But Escape Velocity is super resilient, because it doesn't matter if it's destroyed, you can just keep recasting it from your graveyard. To really get rid of your Escape Velocity, an opponent's going to have to exile it, which is way trickier than just destroying something. Escape Velocity is really powerful in decks with commanders that care about attacking. Take Korvald the Faith-Cursed King, for example. Whenever it attacks, you get to sacrifice a permanent and then draw a card. Having Escape Velocity just sitting in your graveyard, able to give your Korvald or any other attack-based commander haste at any given point is very powerful. Also, as a side note, specifically with Korvald, it's very, very good. Because not only is it a way to give Korvald haste continually, it's something you can sacrifice to Korvald over and over again as well. Escape Velocity is also really powerful with commanders that have tap abilities. Krenko, for example, has a tap ability that says create X 1/1 red goblin creature tokens where X is the number of goblins you control. This is a very powerful way to make a ton of tokens, but typically you have to untap with Krenko. Escape Velocity being this extremely resilient way to always give your Krenko haste is very nice. One thing to point out is that Escape Velocity does give your creature a +1/+0 boost as well. Krenko 10 Street Kingpin reads, whenever it attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then create a number of 1/1 red goblin creature tokens equal to Krenko's power. So not only do we get the benefit from haste with Krenko, but by giving him +1/+0, we actually strengthen his power-based ability as well. And another kind of deck that can really take advantage of Escape Velocity is Voltron decks. Earl the Miststalker, for example, you just want to slap as many auras on this thing as you possibly can. So having this super cheap, super resilient aura that you can always have access to out of your graveyard is very, very powerful. So if your commander benefits from having haste, I think Escape Velocity is sneakily one of the best and most resilient ways to get haste in the format now. So moving on to number 2, we have Furious Rise. Furious Rise is an enchantment that costs 2 and a red. It reads, at the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, you may exile the top card of your library. You may play that card until you exile another card with Furious Rise. So something important to note is that Furious Rise says you may play that card until you exile another card with Furious Rise. Because it says you can play instead of you can cast, that means you can actually play lands you exile with it as well. That means Furious Rise is almost never going to miss. And if you have a commander with 4 power, or if your deck can just easily put creatures with 4 power or greater on the battlefield, Furious Rise is going to quickly turn into a Phyrexian Arena. Phyrexian Arena and cards like it, 3-mana enchantments that draw you extra cards every turn, are traditionally very powerful commander staples. Having a way to continually generate card advantage turn after turn after turn for such a low casting cost is very strong. Furious Rise obviously does have some downsides compared to Phyrexian Arena. You're not actually drawing the card. You're only effectively drawing 1 card at a time with Furious Rise. And also, if you don't have a creature with power 4 or greater, it's not going to be drawing you cards. But it also has some upsides compared to Phyrexian Arena too. Furious Rise exiles the card at the beginning of your end step. That means if you have a 4 power creature on board, play a Furious Rise, your opponents are going to have to answer it before you go to your end step, or you're going to get to exile a card. That's different than Phyrexian Arena, where when you cast it, you have to wait for a whole turn cycle to go by and come back to you before you start drawing cards. A lot of stuff can happen in a turn cycle, and your Phyrexian Arena might not survive, in which case you get no benefit out of it. But if you get at least one exile off of Furious Rise before it gets answered, then at least you're not down a card. Furious Rise can also give card advantage to colors that sometimes struggle with it. Color combinations like red and white, which sometimes have trouble keeping up with other colors in terms of card advantage. Boros and Mono Red now having access to a Phyrexian Arena-like free mana enchantment is a very nice upgrade. But I think my favorite place to take advantage of Furious Rise is in Hellbent decks. Decks with commanders like Hazaret the Fervent or Neheb the Worthy, which specifically wants you to have a low amount of cards in your hand. Furious Rise effectively allows you to cheat that restriction. You can kind of have a secret hand off to the side in exile, allowing you to generate card advantage in this decks without breaking the central mechanic of them. So if your deck can enable it, I think Furious Rise is a lot closer to Phyrexian Arena than people realize, which is what puts it at number 2 on my list of Commander Sleepers from Theros Beyond Death. And the number 1 Commander Sleeper from Theros Beyond Death is Death Bellow Warcry. Death Bellow Warcry is a sorcery that costs 5 and 3 red mana. It reads, search your library for up to 4 Minotaur creature cards with different names, put them onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. So I think everybody reads this card and thinks Minotaur Tribal, and that is where it's at its best. But I think Death Bellow Warcry has combo potential in basically any red deck. And the core of that combo is Fanatic of Mogis and Neheb the Eternal. So Fanatic of Mogis reads, when it enters the battlefield, it deals damage to each opponent equal to your devotion to red. So to find your devotion to red, you count the number of red pips and the mana cost of permanents you control. Then Neheb the Eternal reads, at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, add red mana to your mana pool for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. So let's ignore for a moment that Death Bellow Warcry says 4 Minotaurs, and let's just talk about these 2. So you cast your Death Bellow Warcry, you go and get Fanatic of Mogis and Neheb the Eternal. Let's say that's all the red devotion you have on your side of the board. Just 3, 1 from Fanatic of Mogis and 2 from Neheb the Eternal. So Fanatic of Mogis then deals 3 damage to each opponent. Then you go to your main phase 2 and Neheb the Eternal's ability triggers. Since each of your opponents has taken 3 damage, if you have 3 opponents, that's 9 damage your opponent's taken, and you get to add 9 red mana to your mana pool. This means you actually gain mana off of casting Death Bellow Warcry. And imagine having 5 red devotion. That means you'll deal 15 damage to your opponents and add 15 red mana to your mana pool. That means Death Bellow Warcry is netting you 7 mana. And Death Bellow Warcry says 4 Minotaurs, remember, so you get to go grab 2 other Minotaurs as well. Which Minotaurs are best to grab kind of depends on what other colors you're running. But let's say we went and grabbed a Kragma Warcrawler and a Boros Reckoner. That's 7 red devotion, without even counting any other permanents that are on the battlefield before we cast Death Bellow Warcry. That means our Neheb is going to be netting us 21 mana, and we should be able to just cast out the rest of our hand and hopefully win the game from there. And that's not even taking into account any combat damage we might deal, as Kragma Warcaller does give our Minotaurs haste and +2/+0. I think Death Bellow Warcry has been dismissed as mostly just a Minotaur tribal card, but I think running Warcry and a small package of Minotaurs in pretty much any red deck is going to be very powerful. This combo can net you a ton of mana, let you cast out your whole hand, can pretty easily just burn some opponents out of the game if you have enough devotion to red. And it helps that Fanatic of Mogis and Neheb the Eternal are both pretty playable cards in their own right, so it's not like you're playing some terrible cards to make this work. So the ability to slip this combo package into pretty much any red deck puts Death Bellow Warcry at the top of my list of Commander Sleepers from Theros Beyond Death. So that's going to wrap up my list of top 5 Commander Sleepers from Theros Beyond Death. Let me know if you agree with my list, or let me know if you think there's some cards from Theros Beyond Death that I'm sleeping on too. Anyway, this has been 2D, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.